Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shannon Derejo from Creamer Media Webinars. Welcome to today's webinar on South Africa's transport sector. We've brought together an excellent panel who will unpack the role of private sector participation in revitalising South Africa's transport and logistics systems. A big thank you to our sponsors, Standard Bank, BDO, Oliver Wyman, Tata International Africa, Railway Safety Regulator, FedEx, and Astron for their support in making this conversation possible. Before we dive in, just a couple of quick notes on housekeeping. The Q&A is available at the bottom of your screen. Please post all your questions in there, and our panelists will do their best to cover as many as possible. The chat is also open for your comments and insights, but please remember to post your questions in the Q&A and your conversations and comments in the chat. The session is being recorded and you'll receive the link afterwards. We're also streaming live on YouTube, and that link will be shared in the chat once it's available. So let's get started. Today's conversation will be facilitated by Mark Evans, a partner in the Energy and Natural Resources practice at Oliver Wyman. Mark specializes in helping clients navigate complex operational and organizational challenges in the mining and heavy industry sectors. His deep understanding of these industries and the African continent, combined with his hands-on approach to problem solving, enables him to deliver solutions that not only work on paper, but are also effective in practice. Mark will facilitate the discussion with our panel, which consists of Jacques Taylor, the leader for Africa's distribution operations at Tata International, Leon Bruwer, the managing director for sales in sub-Saharan Africa at FedEx, Siyabonga Mthembu, Nelson Mandela Bay Managing Partner at BDO, Zen Dlamini, Executive Head of Infrastructure and Public Sector at Standard Bank, and Rirhandzu Mashava, Chief Operations Officer at Railway Safety Regulator. I'll hand over now to our facilitator to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you to all those who have joined. I really hope that this is going to be an interesting and thought-provoking conversation. There is no doubt that we're at something of a crossroads when it comes to the future of our infrastructure, logistics, Transnet. The network has woefully underperformed over the last 5 years to the point where producers, exporters are shutting down businesses. They curtailing their own production because they just can't get it out of the country. And that's a problem. That said, there has been a change in mindset. And Transnet or the Department of Transport is actively seeking to understand what private sector want to do to help. In other words, how do they want to participate? There was an RFI released in May earlier this year. And there was a huge amount of interest in that. And we are expecting some RFPs coming out early next year. But the fact that there's huge interest makes this a very interesting conversation because it changes the landscape of our network and how it might be operated. But as you can imagine, this is not a simple thing to do, and there remains a lot of uncertainty. And exactly what's going to happen, we don't know. But we do have a great panel here who've got a lot of experience and understand the situation. So really looking forward to hearing what they have to say about the practicalities, the investments, the regulation, the safety required to make sure that private sector participation can be a success. As Shannon said, please do put questions into the box as it goes, and we'll answer them as and when we have time. Perhaps Jacques, can we start with you?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Jacques. So, why is private involvement critical to South Africa's long-standing transport and logistics challenges? And what are the real-world implications of the current crisis?
Yeah, good question, Mark. So first, I think, Mark, to your earlier point, I think it's fair to say the private sector have shown overwhelming interest in participating in rehabilitation of rail and ports, and have also demonstrated their readiness to invest in capital and expertise. But I think to answer your question, I think I would firstly want to remind ourselves as to why an effective transport and logistics system is important, not only for business South Africa, but for the economy as a whole. So firstly, South Africa has a trade surplus, indicating that we export more than what we import, although both are important for the economy. But just focusing on exports for the moment, we export largely commodities, whether it's hard commodity being minerals or soft commodity being agricultural commodity. But these exporters play in a global arena where they compete amongst others based on quality, but largely on price. So any inefficiency that we have in our logistics and transport system adds cost and result in our exporters being less competitive in the global arena. And for me, that's the reason why private sector needs to get involved, to ensure more efficiency and to ensure that our business sector is more competitive in the global arena.
I couldn't agree more. We need to be competitive. We have to remain competitive. So just from your perspective, then, what can private companies like yourselves, Tata International, play in driving that efficiency and investment in our logistics value chain?
Yeah, I think, Mark, from a private sector point of view, I think there's a couple of areas there where we can and should get involved. First one is around improving efficiencies by bringing specialized skill, by introducing technology, and also by bringing the best practices that can improve performance, especially the performance of the underperforming assets like the ports and railways, as you highlighted earlier on. I also think that private sector involvement can end monopolies. I think the historic monopoly of state-owned enterprises has led to underinvestment, operational failures, and exclusion of the private sector. And I also think the private sector can assist in accessing capital. I think we all understand the pressures that our budget has and the inability of government to fund all these large projects by themselves. So I think access to capital is also an important aspect that private sector can bring.
Once again, agree, because there are some great examples in this country already where the private sector has funded activities which have made a significant difference. Zen, moving to you. The money in this is going to be important. So with private sector coming in, there's going to be returns involved. There's going to be real due diligence required. Question, how is Standard Bank supporting investment in South Africa's transport and logistics sectors, particularly projects that involved private sector participation? I know you guys are very active very across the board.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, Mark, and to the guys that are joining us online. Greetings. We're quite excited about everything that is happening. I know that sometimes we can be detracted by some of the negative things that happen, but at Standard Bank, obviously, our focus is driving the economic growth. And we know that to create a world-class logistics system to support export growth, South Africa has embarked on a massive infrastructure investment drive, which is built on private investment and public-private partnerships to renew the infrastructure. So infrastructure, transportation, obviously, would fall under infrastructure, and we've got subsectors within transportation, which is maritime, your shipping lines and your port operators. You've got your roads, you've got rail, and you've got aviation. And we do play quite a critical role as Standard Bank in supporting across the various subsectors, including your third-party logistics. I see Jacques there, and I see some of the colleagues from FedEx. So one, if you reflect on the role of a private sector participation and what Standard Bank has managed to do, like I'll just touch on ports of entries, for instance. SA has got about 72 ports, and which 53 are land, and we've got the international airports as well as your seaports. And as recent as 2 years ago, the Department of Home Affairs issued an RFP for ports of entries, or if you choose a border post, the 6 border posts. And we played a meaningful role in supporting all the bidders there. And I'm quite excited, Mark, to share that most of the bidders that responded were supported by Standard Bank. And we also play quite a critical role on the aviation, with a focus being on airports. We work quite closely with your AXAs of this world and the Lanseria airport itself. So we recognize how systemic the airports are. If you reflect back in 2020, when COVID hit, we actually picked up how important airports were, and quite instrumental in making sure that we do support the airports. So we're playing a role in some of the airports that are coming up in the country, and we also playing a role when ICTSI and some of the bidders were participating when Transnet issued that Durban Container Terminal Pier 2 to private sector to participate, and we were supporting that course, which cuts across the port operators and the shipping lines. So yeah, we're very excited that the successful bidder now has been mandated, which is ICTSI. The judge actually pronounced on this last week. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Zen. Maybe Leon, can I shift to you? So, a transport and logistics giant, right? Global giants, from FedEx. How has recent changes, policies influenced your ability to effectively export goods?
I think, Mark, good afternoon. Mark, good afternoon to the panel and to everybody that's on this. I think from a logistics point of view, and we're an air freight operator, which we have our own aircraft moving in and out of South Africa. I think over the past couple of years, South Africa has begun to refocus on logistics and strategic enablement of trade, number one. Number two, the government is committed to modernize the infrastructure because it's aging, to make sure that we keep up with the likes of Europe, Asia, US, where we need the infrastructure to land these big aircraft, to make sure that we can communicate with and trade, import into South Africa, outbound to the rest of the world. And then also the strategy will then benefit importers and exporters, not just the logistics companies, and then also foster economic growth. Because, at the end of the day, I think we have a big market that we look at. It's not just from a perishable market. There's goods that leave South Africa. There's e-commerce that comes in. There's e-commerce that go out. It's to market and then to foster that growth. And for us then, how the policies need to work is to make sure it's ease of business. is to make sure the infrastructure and talk a little bit about the ports you spoke about. We talk about the air in and out. What does our infrastructure look like in Cape Town, Durban, Johannesburg? Can they take big aircraft? How do we open those markets to the rest of the world? And I think that's one thing that we certainly look at holistically from a FedEx point of view.
So what are the key changes that you believe are required to make that happen?
Well, one, I think we need there's investment required for sure. Maybe we need to look and say, well, is there private investment or private companies that want to invest within South Africa from airside or consider a landside operation? I think the positiveness is there's a 1.5 billion infrastructure modernization that the government has done. The challenges are still evident within the industry, the infrastructure, operation efficiencies. We look at customs. That's still a Achilles heel. We look at the current port health. That's just been giving us a lot of problems when we have health and medicine coming into South Africa and going out. And then also the growth in leading export hub for sub-Saharan Africa is also one thing that we need to do and implement from South Africa and become truly competitive as an export hub.
Okay. So let me shift tack a little bit. Siyabonga, sorry, I beg your pardon. You asked me to call you Sia, not Sia Khaleesi, but Sia. So Sia, double-barreled question. So what lessons can be learned from, in terms of privatization, from elsewhere in the world, from other sectors, where it's worked? And then what sort of models are you aware of that have worked in terms of either PPPs or PSPs, two different things? So interested. So what works?
No, thanks, Mark, and good afternoon to the listeners. So I'm just gonna touch on two things. I think Zen has covered one of it, obviously being the Durban Tier 2 and the fact that there now has been a ruling. So I think the first one, Mark, is the fact that government is understanding that logistics, ports, rail is critical to our economy. And I think to credit to them, they have been making some significant changes just to ensure that there is an improvement. There was, I think last year, if I'm not mistaken, the creation of what is called ITER, which is called the Independent Transport Economic Regulator. The objective around that was to basically draw down on global best practice in terms of ensuring that there is fair pricing, and then it would also help in preventing monopolization of rail and port. Another thing which has happened as well, especially from a Department of Transport, again linking to what Zen was saying earlier on, is that the department has ensured and they have strengthened the department or the division that deals with tenders, especially when it comes to complex tenders such as these, which deal with multinational. So those are the two things that I would like to touch on. But also, I think the impressive thing that they've done is to come up with what I would call as financing models. Again, the objective is to allow private sector to participate within the ports, the rail, and the infrastructure, and so on. I'm just going to mention a few. One of them is what is called the joint venture approach. The idea there is that they get a private partner to basically fund the capital investment in terms of a port railway line. And then obviously that private investor will then run that port or terminal or railway line, and then they'll be sharing in terms of revenue. Another one is what it's called BOT, which is build, operate, and transfer. The idea again there is that as a private consortium or business, you basically are given a railway infrastructure as an example, which you will then invest on in terms of upgrading. You will operate that line, and then later on, there's an expectation that you'll give it back to the state. The last one that I want to mention is one that is called a co-investment by industry stakeholders. Again, you might be familiar with it, Mark. You're also involved in the mining sector. The idea is there that, as an example, if there is a mine or mines that would want to have access to a particular port terminal, the idea is that, again, they invest capital in improving that infrastructure in exchange of getting priority capacity or discount or reduction in tariffs. So I think just to give credit to the government and understanding the importance of the importance of logistics and infrastructure related to ports, road, railway, and so on, they are doing something to ensure that there's improvement to then contribute to our economy.
Okay, just a follow-up question there then. So what are the biggest risks? And I'm going to follow this with a question to some other panelists, which is, okay, great, private sector wants to participate. What are the risks that we need to be thinking about? What are the major hurdles that are going to stop this from happening?
I think the biggest one is, I mean, at the end of the day, our government is still run by politicians. I think they need to understand that the fact that private sector is getting involved, it doesn't mean that private sector is getting involved just because they want to make profit. They're getting involved because they also want to help in improving the infrastructure of this country, and also to contribute in terms of improving the economy of this country. So I think there's that risk, which then needs to be clearly understood, that, look, the reason why private sector is getting involved is that we literally just want to support and we want to help.
Okay, fair enough. Let's talk about another risk, safety. And maybe we should have done safety first. Good principle. Rirhandzu, how is RSR thinking about this, and how are they adapting frameworks to accommodate for the potential entry of private sector participants?
All right. Good afternoon, Mark, and to everyone who has joined us online. So as South Africa embarks on this very critical journey of revitalizing its rail network, the RSR's paramount mandate remains unchanged. So we do exist to ensure the safety of all rail operations, whether it's for passengers, for employees, or for the public. So for us, the introduction of the private sector participation is a very significant shift, and our regulatory approach obviously is proactively evolving to meet this new reality. So we are also undertaking comprehensive reviews and the modernization of our regulatory framework to be more agile, to be risk-based, and to be outcome-focused as well. So we have also recently reviewed our safety management system determination, which we refer to as the SMS determination, which is in alignment with Section 37 of our Act, and it provides more detail on what requirements need to be met by the operators when they apply or maintain or renew their safety permit. Additionally, we also are enhancing National Information Management System called NIMS, and this obviously simplifies and digitizes the application process and makes the process of applying very efficient and easy. Again, instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, we are now enhancing and moving to a risk-based approach, and we will now be focusing on operators with higher risks. That those ones will be receiving more frequent and intensive scrutiny than lower operators. And the most important thing for us is the promotion of culture as opposed to focusing on compliance. So we are going to be engaging with the new entrants very early into their planning phases, And this is to foster a proactive safety culture from the outset, thereby enabling us to move beyond a compliance checklist.
Okay, good, and absolutely important. And I'm glad to hear that there's progress being made. Zen, love to sort of hear from a financial perspective, your take on the key risks and opportunities.
Yeah, Actually, I wanted to supplement a few points that were made by my fellow panelists, and the ambitious targets that have been set by Department of Transport in terms of improving the tonnage as such. We've just seen like a great turnaround, with Minister Chrissy actually asking for a PSP to be set up, and that has been set up, which has actually made it easier for like the RFI that you touched on, Mark, earlier, to be issued timeously, and getting all these responses from various bidders. And in our travels, like we've been, it's not just about capital, it's not about money, it's about having projects, and it's about like the regulatory environment being quite favorable. When we were in the UAE, we ran an SOC summit in Dubai, which is in its fifth installment. When we were having these conversations with some of the port operators, they were really talking around wanting to do the investments, the regulatory environment, how things will ease. So just from our side, we just think about the condition of the rail network. You've got your train operating companies that have just been appointed most recently. For me as a funder, as I said, it's not about the funding itself, but we have to make sure that as we extend the funding, there is an understanding that the network is and will continue to allow efficient and safe access of locomotives, because the train operating companies make money only when they are on the rails. So if you extending money and the train operating companies are not operating, that is a risk itself. And obviously the adoption of the third party regime by the road freight industry, because it's ultimately the success of the train operating companies, it means taking rail-friendly freight off the roads. So the negotiations need to happen, just to make sure that there is alignment.
So Jacques, if I can ask you then, so what's it going to take to get exactly that? So highly proficient operators onto our infrastructure, and then obviously we need to fix our infrastructure. But what's it going to take? I mean, Tata plays in this game.
Yeah, no, I think a good question there. So first, I can say as Tata, we already invested in a terminal in one of the ports in South Africa. So I think we're putting our money where the mouth is. But I think at a broader level, I think for private sector to effectively participate, in my mind, a couple of things that's really important. First one is to have a supportive legal framework. Secondly, I think there has to be clear regulations, and I think that's work in progress. And thirdly, and for me, maybe the most important one, strong governance to ensure that there's good oversight with this. And then maybe just lastly, Mark, I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel. I think if we look at our road infrastructure, there are good examples of public-private partnerships with toll roads. I think we can maybe debate whether it was successful or not. But I do think we can learn from that as a start.
Absolutely, there are. And there are a number of them. So, Siyabonga.
Sorry, Mark. Yeah,
Yeah,
so maybe just to jump in there, I think
please.
thanks to Tata, I mean, Jacques is saying that look, already they're investing money to try and make sure that there is progress with regards to all of this investment. But maybe another thing that we need to look into as well, I mean, is the fact that South Africans or South African companies do not have experience in, call it, running this type of a business. I mean, the railway, the ports, and all of that have been run by government basically for a number of years. So we also then need to think about how do we then transfer skills. I don't necessarily talk about BE, but how do we factor in transformation? And if there is support needed from incentive point of view, I mean, I lead the automotive sector within BDO. Within the automotive sector, there are a number of incentives and support that the government provides to up and coming companies that are operating within the automotive sector, so that they're upskilled and they've got the funding as well to be able to play in the space. So maybe it's something that we need to look into. Otherwise, we're going to have a situation whereby we're having the multinationals which are operating in the space, which in itself, again, might create a problem in a sense that people are going to start asking now, okay, but what about transferring the skills? What about transformation and so on? Just something to think about.
I think that's a great point, but it also leads to another question, which is, okay, then what do we need to do to make ourselves an attractive investment environment? Yeah, we've heard governance. We've heard about the financial. Yes, there needs to be a financial return for if we're going to get international investors playing on our rail networks. What else do we need to do to make ourselves attractive?
Yeah, if I may jump in on this one, Mark, I think it's mainly the infrastructure. I'm based in Nelson Mandela Bay, and I also sit on the board of the Nelson Mandela Bay Business Chamber. They work a lot in trying to attract international investors. And I think the common thing that comes up or theme that comes up when these multinationals are looking at investing in South Africa, it's infrastructure. Because, I mean, it talks to then the cost of doing your business, like Jacques said earlier on. If you've got the right infrastructure, then you will make it easy to attract investors into this country. We had a session with Hive Hydrogen, who is planning to build up a plant here in Gokra and Nelson Mandela Bay. I think they're planning to spend about 106 billion rand. They told us that, look, they did like an extensive research in terms of looking at different countries globally in Africa, and then they made a decision to come and invest in South Africa because of the infrastructure that we have. But the reality is that the infrastructure that we have is not where it's supposed to be. There's a lot that needs to be done. Hence, the private sector is willing to get involved. And then the last thing is what we touched on, security. And I mentioned this again because you will have a situation where if trucks are pulling out of the Gokra port, they are being burnt. There is riots left and right. So you need to sort out all of those things to make it attractive for not only multinational businesses to operate in South Africa, but even for local businesses.
Maybe let me also come in. Thanks, yeah. Mark, I believe that South Africa is very attractive. We as sexy as we can get. I'm just thinking about the 54 countries in the continent and where SA features. And we are in the top 10 outside of just North Africa countries like your Egypt, Morocco's. But South Africa is an investment hub. I spent some time in Tokyo in July in preparation for the TICAD. We're doing a prelude to TICAD, and the conversations were really around why South Africa and what is happening in South Africa. What I picked up as I was talking to some of the investors in Tokyo was there isn't enough conversations that have been happening about South Africa and what the abundance that we offer. And some of the investors thought that Kenya and South Africa were neighbors, or Kenya is in South Africa. So we had to start doing like that education, and spoke about the infrastructure projects. And when I talk infrastructure, I'm referencing like transportation, like your third-party logistics. We're talking roads, obviously, and like aviation. So we started talking about some of the opportunities that exist. We spoke about the corridors, like the 5 corridors that are up. We started talking about the Gautrain itself, like there's going to be phase 2 of the Gautrain. Guys like if you think about like some of the investors in the Gautrain, like your Alstoms of this world, they're quite optimistic and they understand. So my conversation in Tokyo actually made me realize that we're not doing much, to talk about, to advertise what South Africa has to offer and the abundance that comes with South Africa. There's Buhobai that will be coming up, and we shared quite a number of all these opportunities that are coming just outside of like your Operation Vulindlela or the National Logistics Crisis Committee. And I like the fact that Sia, you touch on a very critical point, is security. The biggest issue in South Africa is security. Vandalism, how Transnet has been derailed, how Press has been derailed, and we see specifically in the construction sector, you get like the mafias, and it's really dealing the security, working quite closely, or maybe elevating the security piece, and to make sure that at least South Africa becomes the sexy South Africa that it is, even for potential investors. Yeah, thanks.
So maybe let's jump to you, Leon. So what do we need to do to make South Africa the sexy South Africa that Zen's talking about?
I think one, you need to open the private sector to get it done. From a regularity standpoint, streamline customs processes, improving interagency coordination and adopting more digital trade solutions, and accelerate movement of goods. And then also a greater policy on consistency of collaboration, like I said, between public and private stakeholders, be essential building blocks for this logistics environment and support growth, reliability, long-term competitiveness for South Africa exporters and also importers is very important because we compete on international markets. Exporters need predictable rules, transparent enforcement, and open channels for public-private collaborations. And I think that is a stoppage at the moment. Ensure that infrastructure investments are completed by regular environment, and it allows goods to move smoothly through business and international markets. And the private sector has got a big part of it to play in that. And as what everybody on the panel said, you need to have that consistency. One, you've got to take lessons learned from other parts of the world and how things work in other parts of the world and bring it back home. We've got a fantastic way of looking at things. We've got the market, we've got the product. It's just to make sure that we get that over the line.
Yep, I tend to agree. I'd like to pick up on 2 things that you just said. So number one, and I'll ask Rirhandzu this, which is, Rirhandzu, so I mean, security has been a concern. Yes, there've been some strides made in addressing certain security issues. How are we going to sustainably address that?
So, and I like the conversation that's happening. There's a lot of things as we promulgate and want to move to a certain direction. There's a lot of risks that we must be very aware of. And again, from a regulator perspective, and we come as policing and wanting the sector to remain very safe, even when the introduction of all these things are coming through. And we're very cognizant that the coming through of the private sector into the network also introduces a certain point of risk. But we also have something called the Annual State of Safety Report, which we publish on an annual basis, which then is able to highlight the areas that we need to focus on, but also showing the different trends and analysis that we do to see where are the pressure points. And we have seen that theft and vandalism has been somewhat reducing. I think the theft and vandalism, the security part of the issues went up, especially during the COVID period. As you can remember, everyone was staying at home and there were no security personnel, even at the stations or in the network itself. So that exacerbated the issue of security challenges and everything else. But as everything is returning back to its former glory, we will see some of the changes coming into the sector. Again, we speak about a culture of safety. And if all the operators embrace that and we work collaboratively, I think we will be able to do that. There is also initiatives that we do, and this is through stakeholder engagements, where you need to bring in the communities to own the network, to own that which is available to them. So when we all take partnership and you make those stakeholders and the communities stewards of whatever it is, then everyone can work towards the reduction of the security and hindrances that we encounter.
Thank you. The second point, which Jacques, Leon mentioned, and I'd like to direct to you, is how do we bring innovation and technology to bear? And how's that going to have a material impact on the success of our logistics networks, number one, but also, yes, privatization, number two. Privatization might bring that. Interested to hear you.
Yeah, definitely, Mark. And I think technology is a broad concept, right? But maybe before I answer that question, I think an example that comes to mind, if you just look at the port across the border at Maputo, Mozambique, and we just see what progress has been made over the past 12, 18 months through a public-private partnership, to a point where a lot of South African companies are moving goods across the border and export through Maputo. So again, I think there's an example on our doorstep that we can maybe look into.
Yep.
Again, technology, broad concept. I think private sector is driven by technology today at various levels. I think for us as an OEM, technology is embedded in products in terms of improving efficiencies, whether it's fuel efficiency, whether it's uptime, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a similar approach that we can follow when it comes to transport and logistics, to say, how do we leverage technology with the aim of improving efficiencies? And again, I think there's numerous examples, Mark, that we can showcase. But I think that's where private sector involvement is critical, because private sector can bring that technology to the table.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to jump to some questions quickly. There's one specifically for you, Zen. What role will the banks play in applying pressure on Transnet and the DOT to put bankable railway access agreements in place? There's a bit more to it, but I think that's fair enough. So how are the banks going to apply pressure? Interesting question. Thank you,
Yvette. I think Yvette knows. The Department of Transport has been very much engaging with all the role players, and I don't think that it is our responsibility to put pressure, because it is a collaboration, and the engagements do happen. I think the conversation has to happen because if you recall, before Minister Chrissy came into power, the network statement was lying there. It was almost like paralysis for the longest time. And we only saw progress when Minister signed the network statement, but it's not been finalized. So it is a conversation that needs to happen with all the stakeholders, not necessarily us as funders, but you playing a role. I think you also play quite a critical role, because it's not just from the banking side. You've got your third-party logistics that actually have a lot to say, and they're doing those engagements. In our most recent summit that we hosted, we did put together from a department and the third-party logistics and Transnet in one room, where conversations happened, and people were actually very encouraged with the progress. So it's the ability to put all the role players in one room and debate the issues, because we're not going to force or put pressure as financiers, but we are working together, because we have to work together. So yes, we create the platform, we create the opportunities for the right engagements to happen, and we nudge things in the right direction, because we have a joint responsibility to deliver this economy, even from your side as well, Yvette. So it's everyone that needs to work together.
Thank you. Another interesting question here, which I'm going to throw open to the full panel, which is, what would the key KPIs be, the key KPIs that would make the private sector to be fully committed and involved, how to deal with and identify the inefficiencies in the value chain, e.g. labor, and turn around, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to read the whole question. It's basically, how is private sector going to be measured in their participation? Now, I know that's a concern, because one of the concerns, for example, in the Transnet RFI is, okay, so we bring private sector in, what happens to our local workforce? So throwing it open to the panel, anyone interested in having an answer?
I think, Mark, I can maybe start off with one part of your question, in terms of how do we measure private sector and make sure that they're successful. Firstly, private sector is committing capital and funds to these projects, and they would want to see a return. And the only way for them to see a return is to manage an effective business operation. So I think private sector has proven themselves that despite a challenging environment, that private sector can still move forward. So I don't think there should be a question in terms of the commitment from private sector, especially if they put money on the table.
I think they'll measure themselves, no problem. But how do they measure their commitment to the participation, I think is the question.
If I can come in there, I think to Sia's point, I think he mentioned something about the private sector then comes in, and what happens then to everyone else that was there. But for everything to work again, I think it's very important that we start singing this issue of collaboration and partnering. There are people in the industry. Transnet has the workforce that have always been there. And these private people that are coming through, if you don't have the necessary skills, you definitely need to bring someone who understands the route, who understands the condition of the network and who's going to enable you to fulfill whatever goals that it was. I mean, already there is projected numbers that need to be reached by 2030. Obviously, you don't go into that blind. You already have a game plan and know, okay, for me to do this, I need to bring these people. So for me, again, it calls upon partnering. And again, with this private sector participation, I know government, when they enter into such things, you go in because you want to leverage something that you were not able to do. And this is where it brings in the innovative part of things and enabling the implementation of certain policy statements that have been put together. So for me, the keyword remains on collaboration in order for everything to work throughout the transport value chain and not just for the rail sector.
Mark, if you don't mind, if I can also just
Please.
jump in. Yeah, I think maybe just to add on what Jacques was saying. So you'll find that the nature of, I'll call it, these private companies that want to participate, it's basically not just any company that is seeing an opportunity to make profit. It's basically companies that are frustrated by the system. Like I said, I mean, I'm based in Nelson Mandela Bay. More than 45% of the automotive industry is sitting here. They're frustrated by the fact that, look, once they've produced, they cannot export their vehicles to Europe. They're also frustrated by the fact that the vehicles that they need to sell locally, send up to Gauteng, they can't because of railway issues. As a result, they need to use roads and all of that. So what they've done is they've built these consortiums where they're bidding for the opportunity to be involved in operating the railway lines and be involved in operating the ports and so on. So basically, them performing it to their benefit. I think same applies to the mines as well. I used to audit the mines in the Northern Cape. Again, they used to be frustrated by the fact that once they've mined their manganese and their iron ore, they now have to use trucks to transport it to the port. So by its nature, the fact that these companies want to participate is because of the frustration that's in the system. It's not necessarily because maybe they just they're seeing call it a business opportunity, but they want to maximize their current existing their business to ensure that they supply to their customers.
I think that's a really good point. I'm now sort of summarizing some of the questions coming through, which is got a lot to do with pricing. So one of the concerns around privatization is what's that going to do to pricing? And I've got a perspective on this, but I'd love to hear your perspective. I will share mine. It's how's that going to change things? Is the fact that, okay, we bring someone in to operate our trains or maintain our trains or maintain our ports, is that going to negatively impact us locally because we're bringing in higher costs? So pricing remains a concern.
Mark, if I can, again, maybe just a thought there. My question would be or my counter question would be what is the opportunity cost of not having an effective logistics solution for South Africa? And it's costing business a fortune. So I think it's not only the price tag, it's around what do you gain by having a more effective and efficient solution in place.
I agree. I totally agree. Yeah.
Just to support Jacques on that one, I think in looking at the pricing, let's look at the entire value chain of the transportation system. If one gets fixed, then it counterfeits the other ones. So even if there would be a price, something, it will leverage itself and smoothen itself out. So for me, it's fixing and integrating the whole system in order to get the goods into the rightful places with the right mode. You don't always, there needs to be the one that starts the journey and the one that ends the journey and the one that runs the journey in the middle. So if everything is able to run effectively and in tandem, then the cost issues are somewhat smoothened out.
And I think maybe just another point as well. I think you offer a business an option or options to say decide where you want to make use of rail or do you still want to make use of road transport. At this stage, business only have one option, which it makes it really, really difficult to negotiate.
Yeah, and that option, which is going to be my point, which is that option is already
Costly.
5 to 7 times higher.
Correct.
So, and so therefore, yes, you put more on the rail. Let's just talk rail, for example. Most certainly, and to Nick, who has asked the question, how can the cost be higher? Won't be higher. It'll be low because you've got economies of scale. Simple. If you use what you have, simply won't be.
Yeah, Mark, if I can also just jump in on this one. I think also, I mentioned earlier on with regards to regulation to help not to monopolize, call it the industry. So by its nature, by allowing competition, then it basically addresses the issue of services being overpriced. I mean, I'll give a good example. The fact that Eskom currently doesn't have competition, they basically increase the rates. Personally, I feel as they wish. I think if there was a bit of competition, then it would basically help in terms of handling the pricing issue.
I just want to come into, Mark, and I think we've got to look at efficiency. So when we look at efficiency, it means that you can get your product quicker to the market. It means that your sales turn will be quicker. One, you are confident that your product's not going to get stuck in a port or on some sort of a rail system somewhere, stuck for weeks. Two, and you can then give some sort of a guarantee for whoever you're dealing with in the world that you would get the product to them in a certain time. If we are now currently relying on state-owned Transnet, port network, can that be done? I'd rather pay the efficiency and get my goods out exported to the market than have a 50-50 chance of not.
Fair enough. Interesting question coming in. I think it's for you, Zen. What is Standard Bank's viewpoint of financially assisting startups by financing them with their trucking projects?
Startups. Okay. I see that. I think I'd like to maybe go back to when we were encouraging migration from rail to roads, and we saw a lot of startups coming into play and supporting them. And that had unintended consequences. Like if you look at the potholes, try driving in Limpopo, going to where Medupi coal-fired power plant is, it's a nightmare. So some of these things have had unintended consequences, and we do support not necessarily startups for tracking, because we know that there is a process of migrating back to rail. I think that's the efficiency that you're talking about. And that's why there are these conversations that are happening now. So when we support, we also take cognizance of like ESG as well. And startup for tracking, that is a conversation that we'll need to have, because Transnet is going back to rail, not the tracking as such.
I'll jump in there a little bit as well, just because I was asked a question. So, we fixed Transnet. What's that going to do to our trucking industry? And my view is the simple answer is maybe stagnate the significant growth that it's had. But I mean, if Transnet's performing, that's good for everyone, but it's not going to hurt our trucking industry. It's our trucking industry is unfortunately in some cases there to stay. Okay, so I'm want to just sort of go around the table and just sort of get some sort of thoughts from the team and uh, the conversation. And if there are any more questions, we'll address them. But perhaps we start with you, Siyabonga. Just parting thoughts.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mark. I think maybe something that we haven't touched on. I mean, when we talk about exports, I think all of us in our heads, we're thinking exporting to Europe and Asia and the Americas and so on. But we haven't necessarily touched on Africa, and we haven't touched on the fact that there's currently your Africa Free Trade Continental Trade Agreement that's in place. So I think it's something that we also need to look into. I think the question that was raised in terms of, okay, now the rail is up and running and everything is running efficiently, what's going to happen to trucks? But the fact that if we move and look into Africa, then it creates another opportunity of actually using those trucks in terms of transporting whatever we're transporting to our fellow African countries. So I think it's something that we need to look into in the context of fixing the infrastructure and talking about logistics and the related issues within our country. And then also what I mentioned earlier on, the fact that we then need to look at the way of transformation. And I'm talking about transformation in a sense that like I said earlier on, most probably it's going to be multinationals that are going to have an opportunity to participate in this partnership that Rirhandzu was talking about. But we need to think about supporting local business, Zen, and see how we can then provide funding, obviously in partnership with the government. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Rirhandzu.
So from our side, as we welcome and we usher in the private sector into the rail network, it's important that we do emphasize that safety is not an obstacle to this reform, but it is an enabler of sustainable growth in the rail sector. So we also do recognize that this period of reform is both a challenge and an opportunity for us to build a safer and a more modern and efficient railway in our country. So our commitment is to provide a very stable, a predictable and rigorous regulatory framework that will protect the public interest while enabling investment and innovation to revitalize our country's critical rail infrastructure. And just maybe to go back to the issue of the transport sector, trucking sector, I think it's important to reiterate that in the whole value chain of the transportation of goods and movement, there is a last mile and there's a first mile. And everyone, I believe, needs to take their rightful place. And the cost of rail is fairly reasonable as compared to the other ones. And let's make rail the backbone of our country, and everyone then gets to eat in the different pie sets. Thank you.
Thank you. Leon.
I think we spoke about infrastructure, private investment, private development. What role does it play in the ports, on rail, trucking? I come from a airline perspective. So if we look at FedEx as an airline, we say what other investments would be required to enhance the airports to make sure that we use ORT maybe as a hub to sub-Saharan Africa for freight. That's something that when you look at, because there's not a lot of air cargo leaving into sub-Saharan Africa or opening markets. We have services leave from here to Kenya to our main hubs in Dubai. But we could look and say the investment would supplement sub-Saharan Africa closer to market when it comes to perishables and so forth. And that's where the trick lies, is to make sure that you invest correctly, but also to make sure that you've got government approval to get the landing rights and create employment. That's the major thing, is to say we create employment, but the benefit is that you have a independent of a private carrier in your country.
Yep, agreed. Jacques?
Mark, I think a lot has been said. First, I agree with what Leon just shared now as well. And I think maybe back to Sia's point. In my mind, effective transport and logistics systems stand to benefit the economy as a whole. And yes, transformation is important. It might not happen, as an example, in the railway part of the sector, but the broader economy stands to benefit and to grow. And I think that's where we can apply transformation as well. I think from a private sector point of view, we already said that there's strong appetite from the private sector to get involved. I think what is needed is an enabling environment where private sector feels safe to invest and have comfort that the investment will be protected.
And that leads on to you, Zen, which I fully support.
Yeah, no, totally, Jacques. You are spot on. I know that despite all the progress that we have seen on the reforms, not everything is happening at the right pace. Mark, some people are saying it's baby steps, and some people are saying Transnet is just crawling. But the reality is, it will take some time before we get to that point. And there's lots of frustration, especially around the network statement. But we need to be cognizant of the timelines. It's not easy. It's not going to be something that will be resolved overnight. We all have to work together and provide the input that needs to be provided, and the engagements. And to Rirhandzu's point, it's the collaboration and the engagements that need to happen. When you talk to shipping lines and port operators, it's a very different response. I can actually see the progress. They acknowledge the engagements that are happening. We're not looking for a monopoly. We want the economy that's going to work for everyone. So I just think that we need to continue having the engagements. The checks, we do have the checks. Capital is not about capital. It's about making sure that we do have those projects that we can support. But let's not forget the ESG or the decarbonization as we talk about the future. And that's really quite important for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Zen. So thank you, everyone, for joining. There you have it from a panel of experts. Certainly what we're hearing is that private sector participation is vital, but it needs to be in the right environment. Private sector needs to be able to generate their returns. Private sector needs to have the confidence that their risks are managed, and that the governance around it is in place. And so thank you to the panel. Thank you for your insights, and thank you everyone on your questions. I'm sorry if we did not get to them. Shannon, I can hand back over to you.
Thanks, Mark. That brings us to the end of today's discussion. A big thank you to our facilitator, Mark Evans from Oliver Wyman, And very much a big thank you to our panelists, Jacques Taylor from Tata International, Leon Bruwer from FedEx, Siyabonga Mthembu from BDO, Zen Dlamini from Standard Bank, and Rirhandzu Mashava from Railway Safety Regulator for sharing your insights, and to all of you for joining us and contributing through your questions and comments. We'd also like to once again thank our sponsors, Standard Bank, BDO, Oliver Wyman, Tata International Africa, Railway Safety Regulator, FedEx, and Astron Energy for making this webinar possible. The recording of today's session will be made available shortly, so keep an eye out for that link. And we hope that you'll connect with us again for our next webinar on the 12th of November at 2 p.m. It will focus on construction, with a panel unpacking what it will take to turn around South Africa's construction sector. The link to register for that event was shared in the chat. And if you'd like to stay up to date with our upcoming webinars and news, be sure to sign up for our free daily newsletter or visit our website. You can also reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. From all of us at Creamer Media Webinars, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.